going to address the issue of perfect competitors in the product and the factor markets and what their graphs would look like. In the product market, we're dealing with firms as sellers. They're producing and selling a product. And that product, that good or service, will be identical, completely identical to the goods or services that are sold by all the competing firms in this market. And because all the goods are identical, the firms cannot compete on price. They're perfect substitutes for one another. The firms will be price takers, and the price for the good or service will be determined by the market for that good or service. So our individual firm has no control whatsoever about the selling price of the product. When we look at this firm, it's going to have a unique demand curve because the demand curve is going to be determined by the market. Remember, our seller has absolutely no choice in what the price will be. So the only choice it has is in how much it wants to sell. So the market will determine the price that the seller has. And that price will be the same no matter how many units the seller sells. So we call this price the firm takes, P sub F, is going to be the demand that the firm faces. But because each item that the firm sells will be sold at exactly the same price, it will also be the firm's marginal revenue. It will also be the firm's marginal revenue. Marginal revenue simply means the additional money that comes in from selling one more item. The firm has to decide how much it will produce. And our rule about profit maximizing production is that we produce until marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Once again, profit maximizing production, we produce until the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Our marginal cost curve looks like a check mark or a Nike swoosh, and we label it MC. The marginal cost is the slope of the total cost curve, and it represents the additional cost that comes from making one more unit. In the short run, our marginal cost is equal to our variable cost. Once again, in the short run, marginal cost is equal to variable cost. Now that we have a demand curve, a marginal revenue curve, and a marginal cost curve, we can determine both the price that the firm will charge and the quantity the firm will produce. The firm is going to produce the quantity where MC crosses MR. That gives us our quantity for the firm, Q sub F. Now, we already determined that the price will have to be determined by the market for the good, and that means price taker, our firm really doesn't have any choices there. So this is what our cost curves look like. How much we will produce and how much we will charge for this item. Of course, if we were going to determine profit or loss, we'd need a third curve. We'd need average total cost. But right now, we're just going to compare what these markets look like for the basic curves. We're not worrying about profit or loss at the moment. We're now going to compare it to the perfect competitor in the factor market. In the factor market, a perfect competitor is a buyer, not a seller. And it's buying resources. So our perfect competitor in the factor market could be anything in the product market. It could be a monopoly. It could be a monopolistic competitor. It could be an oligopoly. It could be a perfect competitor. It doesn't matter. You can be any of those things and still be a perfect competitor in the factor market. What distinguishes a perfect competitor in the factor market from a monopsonistic competitor in the factor market is that in the factor market, our perfect competitor is buying a perfectly identical resource, say electricity. The electricity that's purchased by BP is the same electricity that I purchase in my home. So In this market, the firm is competing with all other firms who use the same resource, and the resource is identical. Because the firm is competing with everybody else for an identical resource, the market for the resource will determine the price that the firm pays, and the firm is a wage taker. So now we're going to graph the firm purchasing resources in a perfectly competitive resource market. Once again, we need a demand curve, but this time, remember, we're dealing with a buyer. We're dealing with a buyer. And our firm is going to buy based on, well, what's in it for the firm. The firm is looking at how much this particular item will, or this particular resource, will gain it in profit. So it's going to look for how much revenue it gets by purchasing an additional unit of the resource. We call this MRP. It's a downward sloping demand curve, but we're concerned about how much additional revenue comes from hiring one more unit of this factor, of this resource. We are in that perfectly competitive market. So one of the things you should recognize about perfectly competitive markets, somebody is going to have a perfectly elastic curve. And in this case, that somebody is supply. The supply of the resource will be determined by the market. And as long as our perfect competitor here is willing to pay the market price, they can buy as much of this resource as they want to have. They can buy an infinite amount if they want to. The question is always, how much do they want to buy? So in this case, the market will determine the price that is paid, or the cost that is paid for the resource. And it will be a perfectly horizontal supply curve. Now, our supply for the firm is the firm's marginal resource cost, or MRC, for the firm. MRC is the additional cost that comes from hiring one more unit of the resource. We need to now to determine what our quantity is going to be, and as you already know, quantities always happen where the marginal sticks cross. So where the marginal resource cost crosses the marginal revenue product, or marginal factor product, or marginal factor cost, depending on the terminology you use. Remember, resource and factor are interchangeable. That's going to be where we get our quantity that we purchase or hire. So now that we have all this together, let's compare the two graphs side by side. Remember, in one market, the firm is a buyer. In one market, the firm is a seller. So there are some similarities. Our first similarity is that both of them have a perfectly horizontal curve. For the seller market, the product market, that perfectly horizontal curve will be demand. When the firm is acting as a buyer of a resource, the perfectly horizontal curve will be supply. The marginal resource cost becomes the supply for the firm. The marginal revenue is the demand for the firm. So remember, terminology matters. It's marginal revenue when you're a seller, and marginal resource cost when you're a buyer. Our supply curve, when we're sellers as individual firms in perfect competition, is our marginal cost curve, and specifically the marginal cost curve above average variable cost. Remember, average variable cost determines your shutdown point, and you will not produce anything below the place where marginal cost intersects with average variable cost. So marginal cost functions as the firm's supply curve. Over here on the buyer end of things, if we're purchasing a resource, we have to remember to add an additional name to our demand curve. Our demand curve is our marginal revenue product. So as you can see, there are some similarities between these two markets. If it says perfect anywhere, some curve has to be perfectly horizontal. Keep that in mind. One last thing. Couple of formulas. So formula number one, marginal cost is equal to the change in total cost divided by the change in output. On the other hand, in the factor market, our marginal revenue cost is equal to the change in total cost divided by the change in the amount of resource purchased. Could be workers hired, could be joules of electricity used, whatever. On our product side, remember, marginal revenue is equal to the change in total revenue divided by the change in output. Our marginal revenue product is equal to the change in total revenue divided by the change in the amount of resource that's purchased. There's another way to figure your MRP. It could also be marginal revenue multiplied by marginal physical product, also known as marginal product. Interchangeable terms. Marginal product is the change in output, the amount of product made, divided by the change in resource.